Welcome to the complete Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier list. A tier list where I try to rank all 400 decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! So, here's a quick recap of the rules. First, this is for the modern TCG side of the game, not the OCG or Master Duel formats of Yu-Gi-Oh! Second, in order to easily categorize what is a deck, I've broken it down mostly into archetypes, with plenty of slots for unique strategies like Rock Stun, Nurse Burn, and Chain Burn. This makes it mostly easy to recognize what each deck is from a glance at the tier list. The archetype system also means that decks are ranked as their strongest version, or variant, while still using that archetype or strategy as its core. For example, Mecha Phantom Beast could be listed as a deck using the Super Heavy Samurai engine, since that might be the strongest build of Mecha Phantom Beast. But Super Heavy Samurai will be ranked higher as a deck on their own, since they're better at using different engines or just being used together pure. Let me explain the tiers. There's 11 tiers spread out between 10 and 0. A ranking of 10 is game warping, traditionally what is known as a tier 0 deck. A ranking of 0 means it's literally not a functional deck. Like, this is just a collection of cards Konami printed as pack filler and never finished. The 3 to 5 range is roughly casual decks, and the 6 to 9 range is roughly where the competitive game takes place. Check out part 1 for tiers 0 and 1. Now we move up to tier 2, or decks that are almost unplayable. Here, decks start to have a consistently playable strategy, albeit maybe not one of quality. We're still quite below being able to deal with hand traps and other disruptions, but with some outside support and a whole lot of luck, we can maybe maneuver around some positions. Power Tool Dragon is a 5D's anime signer dragon who never quite stuck the landing into the TCG, unlike Stardust, Black Rose, and Ancient Fairy Dragon. What Power Tool wants you to do is equip a lot of powerful equip spells to him and make a big boss monster. As an archetype, this deck is really only good because of its big boss monsters, particularly the new Power Tool Braver Dragon, who not only fetches the equip spells out of the deck, but he is also a quick effect monster negate. There's a fair bit of support for Power Tool, but none of it is really effective in supporting the Power Tool equip strategy, outside of maybe an extra draw and some bad recursion. Plus, you still have to deal with the extremely bricky nature of equip spells. This deck is almost exclusively paired with Morphtronics, as its unique equip card also synergizes with them. However, Mecha have also been seen to use a Power Tool engine in some niche builds. Ally of Justice are a weird series of anti-light side deck cards that apparently were supposed to be a deck. This means that on one hand, if our opponent is playing a light type deck, then we can actually get some wins. On the other hand, if our opponent is playing literally anything else, then we do nothing. We can rip light monsters out of the opponent's hand, lock out light monsters from being special summoned, and banish light monsters from the graveyard. Unfortunately though, even in our good light matchups, Ally of Justice don't have any cards that actually progress their own game state. That means no starters or extenders, so good luck trying to pilot this mess. Super Defense Robots, or Orbital 7, are a gimmicky yet cool offshoot of Photon that really just don't play well with Photon or Galaxy cards. It can special summon out easy rank 3, 4s, and 8s, so that's pretty good. It's also got a solid rank 8 beatstick boss monster that has some good recursion. The deck also has amazing synergy with generic machine support, like Urgent Schedule, Machine Duplication, and Gear Gigant X. Here's the same list as last time, since nothing's changed. The only thing stopping this deck from being higher is that it's just a bit too slow to see more play. It's consistent enough, but that's not going to fix the end goal issues. Ritual Djinns, not to be confused with XYZ Djinns, are a series of monsters that give effects to monsters when they're used for ritual summons. This strategy was unironically tier 0 back when Necros were first released, and when Djinn Releaser Rituals wasn't banned. He gave the effect to lock an opponent out of special summoning while we control a monster that used him as material. Nowadays, all this deck does is just give targeting protection to a ritual monster, or it can negate every synchro summon monster's effects. These aren't actually bad options at all, and can fill a hole in some ritual strategies. The downside is, Djinns aren't searchable, and really do not help with consistency in an already bricky mechanic. Typically these will get paired with Vendreads or Necros, which I would recommend if you're feeling spicy. Venoms are the worst of the reptile strategies, having the unfortunate gimmick of using Venom counters to make an opponent's monsters lose attack, something that modern Reptilian support does for free. Outside of slow ways to put Venom counters on opponent's monsters, this deck has a notorious extra win con on an impossible to summon boss monster. It requires a trap card and tons of battle phase shenanigans. Ultimately though, this deck is held up by how good modern reptile support is. Reptilian, B.E.S, and even aliens give this deck options enough to put it high on the tier list. Though if we're being honest, just play literally any other reptile deck. All Snake Rain does in this deck is give your boss monster 2000 more attack. TCG exclusive archetypes introduced a lot of fun gimmicks, some of which were absurdly powerful meta decks like B.E.S, Spiral, or Cosmos. Others were half-forgotten thoughts like Dream Mirror, FA, and Jurrac, but these are still considered to be decks, unlike the truly forgotten wave of normal Pendulum monsters released early into Arc V's run. This line of cards put the effects of monsters into the Pendulum scale and still let the deck synergize with normal monster support. The largest wave of this support came in the form of the Dragoons, a battle phase focused series of dinosaurs riding dinosaurs with guns. They turned the entire thing into the world's most janky OTK strategy. But this deck has surprisingly good access to synchros, great synergy with other Pendulum cards, and of course, the ability to use cards like Unexpected Die, Painful Choice, and Summoner's Art for consistency. This deck is most commonly paired with Draco Slayers. It's not hard to see why, as they have a ton of normal monsters. However, this deck can also work with Igknights or Pendulum Magicians, since they both have normal monsters as well. There's a ton of room to explore and deck build in this space, but no one wants to, since it has two mechanics that inherently aren't great. Hazy Flame are very unfinished,
God left me unfinished!
Very bad rank 6 spam deck. In order to summon most of their cards, they either need to draw the specific spell card, Hazy Pillar, or they need to go second. The deck has some summon potential with Hazy Flame Periton if we ignore Ash Blossom. Hazy Flames are also famous for having Hazy Flame Basilatrus, a very easy Towers type monster. It unironically has a great basic effect of a field or graveyard banish. But since it needs two fire type monsters specifically, there's never been anything able to actually run it. Classic support cards include Celestial Observatory for a level 6 specific trade-in, and Rekindling as an amazing combo extender and comeback tool. That is if we don't mind playing the bad Hazy Flames. For modern support, we can use Ready Fusion for a free level 6 fire material, and I've also seen Hazy Flames wonderfully blended with Rescue Ace, since Rescue Ace also have a level 6 monster and are fire type. Genex are from the earliest waves of Dual Terminal. As such, they're a series of poorly designed, very bad, and disparate cards. Surprisingly, this deck is unable to form much of a coherent strategy, even with the 42 Genex cards currently in the game. However, Genex do have a few very solid cards holding the deck together. Genex Blast Fan lets us search for a Dark Genex card when it's special summoned. Genex Oracle lets us special summon itself when it's searched, and Genex Ally Birdman lets us special summon it by returning a card to the hand. These cards, when combined with modern generic support, let us actually create some powerful combos. Link Spider actually lets us summon the Genex controller we search off Genex Undying. Number 60, Digress the Timeless, actually lets us loot Blast Fan and Oracle. I think you get the point from here. You can look at the deck list I've linked in the description to get some descriptions of these combos. They're all quite well done. Trap monsters are a fun gimmick that have continuously gotten new support under the radar. The deck hasn't actually gotten any better for it, but it exists. Let's start by going over the good. Thanks to the card Angel Statue Azarun, the deck has a special summon negate, and thanks to Statue of Anguish pattern, the deck also has removal. The two Tiki Continuous traps give access to battle shenanigans that are solid, and Imperial Custom gives protection. Thanks to the new cards in Photon Hypernova, Crawdon the Clear-Sighted, and Pharaonic Advent, the deck can now activate a trap card immediately and get in some searching. Despite this, the deck still has a ton of problems. It still wants to go first, its searches are hard to use, and it needs to see specific cards to play around removal. You're just not gonna see Lord of Heavenly Prison every game. Maybe this deck could see a resurgence if Konami ever decides to release a meta continuous trap deck again like Eldritch, but honestly I doubt that would fix it. In any case, for now, it's stuck in tier 2. Here's a good build pairing the deck with Urea, Lord of Searing Flames. It's got quite a bit of spice, plus Fallen Paradise, which actually gives you draw power. Cloudian are a very bad combo strategy, with the funny ability to sometimes hand loop the opponent. Cloudian Atlas is a theoretically infinite discard. More often than not, you'll be using a 3-card combo to loop the effect. But more importantly to the deck's combos is Cloudian Smokeball, a Mystic Shineball type monster that can be repeatedly summoned by Cloudian Turbulence. Outside of that, since the deck is both water and fairy type, we get to abuse a lot of outside support. We can abuse Frogs, Bahamut Shark, and Stealth Kraken for simple negates, and we can also abuse Heralds for unique hand traps. Following up on this, we can use Summon Cloud to then recur our discards. Overall, it makes for a surprisingly powerful, if extremely consistent and disruptible deck. Level Up is a collection of wacky individual monster lines with the unique gimmick of trying to level up on a monster through usually absurd and slow cost. Technically, this deck is split up amongst several other smaller lines. Horse already got its own spot on the tier list, as will Dark-Armed Dragon later. The best monsters for the generic strategy are the non-level Silent Swordsman and Silent Magician, since they're spell negates. Unfortunately, most of the other level monsters are just bad and take multiple turns to level up on their own. Plus, to top it all off, you have to run a lot of bricks to level up your monsters at all. Both the level monsters themselves and the cards to try to speed it up. It's just not a good time, outside of very casual anime duels with friends. Yubel is the classic GX monster that revolves around evolving every time the card gets destroyed. Once this is done 3 times, we get a reverse battle damage monster with in-phase removal and the bare minimum of recursion. At first glance, it might seem like a very difficult requirement for a very mediocre boss monster, and it is, but we can set it up easier thanks to a few outside archetypes. We can cheese Yubel's first effect by destroying it with Fire King Island or Gorgonic Diagram. We can also use Yubel's board wipe effect to trigger our Fire Kings, making a surprisingly fleshed out and decent strategy, even if it's just extremely casual, prone to bricking, and vulnerable to almost any non-destruction form of removal. Hopefully though, once the new Fire King structure deck releases, I can reevaluate Yubel's spot on the tier list. But for now, it's firmly a tier 2 deck. Gorgonics are a level 3 rock spam deck. Most monsters in this deck have weird non-synergistic effects. Carrying the weight of the entire archetype is Gorgonic Gargoyle offering 1 free special summon with our rock normal summon, and Gorgonic Guardian, an actually amazing rank 3 monster negate. The answer for how to play this deck is very straightforward. Cut the entire engine outside of the 2 previously mentioned cards, throw them in an already built out Emancipator list, and boom, competence. Unfortunately, an actual deck list with the other Gorgonic cards doesn't do much outside of hurt consistency. So this deck isn't getting that high on the tier list. It also doesn't help that level 5 isn't the best for synchro summoning if we can't make Denlong or Naturia Beast. Surprising most people with its inclusion on the list, it's Entities. You know those 2 broken and banned extra deck cards? Elder Entity Norden and Outer Entity Azathoth? Well, they're part of an archetype with actual support. Mind you, with those 2 cards banned, the archetype is somewhat pointless. But what isn't in this tier? Forbidden Trapahedron is one of the better, if harder to use, special summon spells, setting up for funny, stupid combo shenanigans. I think this could be used for a Sophia Turbo build, but that's just me. Dreamland is a surprisingly okay consistency booster, but outside of that, the deck is lacking in in-goal, and for the most part is just weird generic extra deck support. I'm mad that Konami never actually continued to release support for these guys, within like their own archetype. It's got some of the best art in the game, and it's just sad. Treasure Panda is a deck based around 1 accidentally cracked bulk common in 2018. Treasure Panda lets you banish up to 3 spells or traps from the graveyard to special summon 1 normal monster from the deck with the same level as the number of cards banished. Most importantly, there's no once per turn clause at all. There's a lot we can do with this. The most common thing to do with it is Exodia, since Exodia already plays a ton of filler spells and has level 1 normal monsters to boot. Put Exodia and Treasure Panda together, and you end up with a still inconsistent Exodia deck that even has more choke points than usual. This is because you need to add the pieces back to your hand somehow. A probably better use of Treasure Panda is for Cannon Soldier FTKs. It's not exactly the hardest loop to set up if we're ignoring hand traps. Fishborg are a collection of strong water recursion monsters that unfortunately don't really fit into any major deck. Well, at least not now, since Fishborg Blaster was banned for not being a hard once per turn, and therefore a loop enabler. Plus we have Ronin Tonin being banned, taking away another good play for the deck. Fishborg have a bigger problem of not sharing any consistent level, meaning the go-to fish plays of Totally Awesome and Bahamut Shark aren't easily available. Luckily, with the increasing variety of water links, this engine may find a purpose in the next few years. Here's a surprise to see on the tier list, it's Dragon Rulers, only being this low since 2 of them are banned and the other 2 are limited. This deck does finally have some space to breathe and play as an actual strategy with the newer ban list. However, it's still lacking any sort of consistency with the ratios as they are. More so than that, Dragon Rulers haven't aged particularly well. Their search effects don't play well with hand traps, they're extremely costly to use, and most importantly, they don't work well with most powerful strategies in the game as they currently are. Take Dragon Link for example, it's mostly lights and darks to synergize with chaos support. There's no real home for this once tier 0 threat, outside of as a niche tech and rogue decks. Maybe as the other Dragon Rulers start to come off the ban list, we'll see some changes to their position in the game. But I think that's quite a ways off, since Konami wants to take it so slowly with removing cards from the ban list to sell new sets. Despite being the pioneer in hand traps, Kuriboh does not make a good deck. Kuriboh as a strategy are based around trying to spam out as many Kuribohs as possible from the deck. To do this, we're using a combination of anime cards from throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history. From Multiply to Curry Babylon, this deck can maybe pop out enough link materials to make an Appaloosa. That is, if you don't get bogged down by the 20 plus brick Kuribohs you have to play to make the deck work. Unfortunately, despite the 30 plus Kuriboh monsters released over the years, only like 5 of them are good, and only about 2 of them are usable in this deck. This decklist I'm showing to you by D is notable for being a Master Duel decklist, and for being the only competent decklist to even try to turn this engine into something competent. It still has the problem of being destroyed by hand traps and the inherent consistency, but there's a spark that could definitely turn out great if we could find a good level 1 deck to pair it with. Jurracs are objectively the worst variant of dinos. Most of its large monsters are generic beat sticks, and hilariously, Jurrac's big synchro monster, Black Rose Dragons itself, but also cost an absurd amount of resources to make. Jurrac Aleo gives this archetype niche usage in other dino builds, but it's literally the only decent effect in the deck. Jurracs are only this high because of how absurdly good and abusable generic dinosaur support is. Miscellaneousaurus, Ground Xeno, and Fossil Dig let this deck have absurd consistency, amazing setup, and actual inboards as well. The problem is, Jurracs don't bring anything of their own to the table. When you play like this, most Jurrac cards might as well be normal monsters, so I can't justify putting them any higher. Here's one that might offend anime fans. It's Egyptian Gods, the big bads of the OG anime that just never landed in the card game, requiring an astonishing 3 tributes and still not having good effects, outside of maybe Slifer in some matchups. The Egyptian Gods have had some very crazy support throughout the years, the Revived Sky God being a draw 6, several archetypal cards being able to search Monster Reborn, and the entire Slime archetype. Unfortunately, a lot of these cards serve to add in effects that should have been on the Egyptian Gods in the first place. It has the unfortunate effect of making these decks extremely bricky. For example, if you want to get full value out of the Winged Dragon Ra, you need Ancient Chant, Blaze Cannon, the True Sun God, and maybe Sun God Unification for good measure. You'll still need to find tributes too. I am making the sound way worse than it is, but I have to be like this or I'll get anime fanboys defending this mess. Most competent lists I see trying to play Egyptian Gods end up on just deciding on one god to build around. The best, of course, is Slifer. Speaking of which, here's a terrible idea for a Slifer deck using Flower Guardians. I don't think this list is great at all, but the concept is really cool. Another janky water deck is Penguins, comboing flip effects, anime support, and generic water engines. Penguin's built-in removal is all about setting up for insane board bounces. For example, using Penguin Brave to flip up Penguin Soldier on the opponent's turn. Penguins have a surprising amount of consistency thanks to Royal Penguin's Palace and Great Emperor Penguin. Combine this with modern water support, and you'd almost have a competent deck, if you didn't have to worry about hand traps, literally any disruption, consistency, going first, playing into removal, etc. I see Penguins most commonly paired with Ice Jade, since Ice Jade offer protection for this fragile deck, as well as some more summon options for Great Emperor. It's not fixing the deck per se, but it is a really good concept. Personally, I think the deck works best with generic water stun options, like Barrier Statue, Kairyu Shin, and the Umi lineup. It is player preference though. Tier 3 is where decks start becoming actual decks. Decks might be able to play through a hand trap with some consistency, and some decks might have a solid win condition. However, decks here have core problems that keep them from competency or consistently winning games. Maybe the inboard is bad, maybe the consistency is terrible, and maybe the deck can't play around disruption well. In this tier, we're also going to see quite a few bad loops and gimmick strategies. Consider this tier to be Konami's weird experiments. Star Warriors are a collection of level 5 Light and Earth Warrior monsters that I'm sure most people forgot were supposed to be a deck. They require a series of hoops to get each successive member of the archetype onto the field. What actually holds this deck together is the actually solid fusion monsters. These give searching and let us OTK very easily. The only thing holding back this deck is how annoying it can be to special summon each of the level 5 monsters to get the ball rolling. You'll often end up either already having to control a level 5 monster, or to go second, which isn't ideal in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! There are a few good engines we can pair the deck up with. Battle Guards for level 5 synergy, Assault Mode for more level 5 synergy, or Despia for better access to the fusions. In any case, it will probably be a bit rough finding good ratios for the Star Warriors. Here we have our first split deck for the tier list. It's Spell Counters and Endymion. While Endymion use Spell Counters combined with the Pendulum mechanic to set up massive multiple negate boards, and pull tons of powerful cards from the deck, the vast majority of other Spell Counter support is terrible. We have a variety of slow search effects, janky recursion, and some admittedly good removal options. It does make sense though that these options from 2008 wouldn't hold up at all. But this deck does have some valid options. Spell Power Mastery is a great consistency card, Selene Queen of the Master Magicians is amazing recursion, and Megaton Magical Cannon will never not be funny to resolve. Of course, back when Tempest Magician was in the game, spell counters could be played as an FTK deck. Not only that, but a really easy one too. However, even still, there's nothing this deck does well outside of some removal options, and it's certainly not better than its Pendulum counterpart. Flamvell are another Forgotten Fire Synchro archetype that is very similar to Lavavel. While Flamvell's individual monsters are better as a whole, they don't quite reach the insane wombo combo potential of Lavel's. They do have access to Rekindling, which is still an insane card, but what makes Flamvell's unique is their ability to banish cards from the opponent's graveyard and get value for it. At its best, it means controlling graveyard decks and triggering abilities like Neo Flamvell Lady, who can dump a generic fire monster from deck to grave. But it means the cost for those effects can either be getting hand-trapped or going second. Speaking of going second, a lot of this deck's effects are battle-related, which isn't a good thing. Luckily, this deck has great synergy with anything fire-type, but that only carries this mess of a deck so far. We can actually run a Lavavel engine to make Rekindling terrifying, or we can throw in a Resonator engine to actually try and get some Synchro monsters. Even with everything, there's only so much we can do with these subpar monsters. Heraldic Beast are a surprising fan favorite bad archetype, known for being from the Zexal anime and focusing on graveyard recursion and psychic type XYZ summons. The deck contains a whopping 9 monster reborns for heraldic monsters and 6 different cards for searching them. What holds back this engine is the lack of decent psychic monsters to go into and the potential difficulty from loading up the graveyard. Also, since several cards lock you into only psychic monsters from the extra deck, you're going to be making Time Thief Redoer a lot. It really is a shame that the actual Heraldic XYZ monsters are just terrible. Number 18 Heraldic Patriarch requires an opponent to control 2 monsters of the same name to use. There's not a single deck on this list that can't play around this. At least, the graveyard effect is nuts. Overall, don't let the extra deck take away from the surprisingly good Heraldic engine. Fairy Tail are a collection of spellcaster furries with 1850 attack and with 1000 defense. This of course means they share support with Charmers. More on Charmers later. What Fairy Tails bring to the table is a collection of mismatched effects, with Fairy Tail Luna being decent and with Fairy Tail Snow being banned. The other 3 Fairy Tail monsters mess with flip effects, equip spells, and adding cards from your opponent's deck to your hand. Even if the support for these cards were good, it would still be hard to effectively use these cards in a competent strategy. Typically, the deck ends up being more of a search engine for Charmers, to set up for a Link 2 or Rank 4. Outside of that, this deck's options just feel unfinished. Hands are a kamikaze deck that are known for blowing themselves up on an opponent's monster, then tagging out into another one to do it again. This deck does have a few other pieces of support cards, like Thunder Hand that lets you special summon him from hand, or Grave and pop 1. Magic Hand lets us punish our opponent for searching, and Prominence Hand is a free special summon. Unfortunately, this deck or engine hasn't really been relevant since 2014. It had issues back then, and it's certainly not usable now. The hands can miss timing, be hit by hand traps, or just be powered through by most modern decks. This deck also struggles to find a home, since we have to be destroyed by an opponent's card or effect. This means we can't just Dragonic Diagram our hands. Here's a deck I made called Kamikaze Turbo. The goal is to run into an opponent's monsters as quickly as possible to either OTK or wipe their board. I'm using the Gusto package to reverse OTK with Spirees. If you've liked this deck list and all the hard work I've put into the video, make sure to subscribe. I think I'm committed to this series, despite its lackluster performance on YouTube, so do be sure to subscribe and whatnot to get YouTube to like this a bit more. It's especially rough, since this series knocks out my ability to do other content. This is the Hunder archetype. It might just seem like generic Thunder support, but I can confirm that this is an actual deck that just never got all of its support from the anime, which we have been waiting for almost 10 years at this point. To be fair though, it could summon itself out of the deck, probably trigger off Thunder Dragons, but could the game really get worse? For what Hunders are now, are pretty solid. You can unironically just play 3 out of the 4 Thunder cards in any Thunder deck, and it's not going to be terrible. It's just Hunders don't bring much to the table compared to other options. Why run Hunders and Thunder Dragons when you could just run Aloof Lupine or Battery Man? Maybe with the new wave of Watt support releasing, Hunters could see some usage, at least on a casual level. Aquaactresses are a water spam deck with a very small one-time wave of support. Their main gimmick is getting to revive water monsters from grave if one of their continuous spells is sent to the graveyard. Unfortunately, outside of that, these continuous spells are kinda terrible, mostly being focused around the battle phase. The biggest use for this engine is as a level 2 spam engine, letting the deck go into totally awesome. The problem with that is, only one of the Aquaactresses is actually a level 2. So to really get this engine going, we're gonna have to combine it with an outside deck. I've seen it paired with what remains of Frogs, Ice Jades, Paleozoics, the Adventure Engine, and what's probably the best pick here is Ice Barriers. That way we can actually get some use out of the battle phase effects in the Aquaactress's continuous spells, as well as getting more spam material. Do note, this list I'm showing is for Master Duel, and as such, it isn't running totally awesome. Summon Skull are more of a collection of pretty nostalgia artworks than an actual deck. It tries to combine Synchro, XYZ, Ritual, and Fusion summoning together, while working around a vanilla level 6 monster. The extra deck monsters do actually work together, granting Summon Skull monster protections, plus they all float into Summon Skull from anywhere if they're destroyed. These cards have the quirk of being considered Archfiends, so we can actually cheese them out in an Archfiend build. We can use advanced Ritual art to go into the Ritual monster, if we even want to try to do it. I can't offer a lot of advice for how to play this deck, since the options are so limited, but here's a very based, albeit dated build, attempting to cheese out the extra deck monsters, using Punk and Virtual Worlds. We could probably make this work if we could find a better main deck fusion spell. Also, Ready Fusion could help here. Someone should work on this to make this cracked, or maybe we could just wait for the inevitable anime support. Triamid are a rock field spell deck with only 3 uses of note. First, they have a really funny OTK option that is way harder to use than it should be. Second, they can technically work with any field spells, and third, they have solid synergy with Rock Stun. The real issue here is that the Triamid monsters themselves don't do enough to justify their usage. You get an extra normal summon and a set card pop. This would be pretty good if it was 2014. However, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, this isn't it. You're more or less forced to use Ties of the Brethren to pull out better rock monsters to make this strategy work, thus turning the deck into Rock Stun, but with weaker back row. I'll actually show another deck list for this deck. This is Evil Eye Triamid, a monstrosity with the gimmick of getting value for playing through spells and being able to resolve Ties of the Brethren on any monster for funny value. I fully recommend this terrible idea of a deck. It will not go well, but man is it funny. Here we have another deck split. Timeaus the Legendary Knights are the subcategory of the line of Legendary Knight support that actually focuses on using the Legendary Knights, and it's not just the engine used for Dark Magician decks. The deck's goal is to either use a combination of the anime Dragon cards, or make Timeaus the Knight of Destiny to win the game. The deck can fusion summon with traps for a lineup of questionable monsters, the Legendary Knights themselves have okay removal effects, and Legend of Heart has big potential to pop off once you spend an absurd amount of time and resources setting it up. That's really about it for the good. The deck has all of the problems of anime support, wacky summoning conditions, either nuts or useless effects, and an absurd amount of bricks that need to be ran for the strategy to even be attempted. This list I'm showing you now was almost a good deck, at least before Verte Anaconda was banned, making much of the combos used in this profile worthless. Unfortunately, you'll probably just fall back on Dark Magician support to try hopelessly to make the deck work. Here we have a fan-favorite janky strategy. It's Nurse Burn, combining Dark Lord Nurse Reficule, who can flip life gain effects to burn effects for the opponent, using funky traps like Gift Card to OTK the opponent, with incredibly linear combos. It's surprisingly easy to search Dark Lord Nurse between the Dark Lord support and the many different pot cards and miscellaneous draw cards of Yu-Gi-Oh! The life point gaining is split between cards like Gift Card, the Paths of Destiny, and Try and Guess. This deck remains almost unchanged since it got revamped with Dark Lord support around 5 years ago. Of course, this strategy is vulnerable to hand traps and has massive consistency issues. But what really holds it back is how dependent it is on going first and its lack of any other options. This is a bit of a tangent about gimmick kills that's probably going to be relevant later along the list. An FDK is only fully meta if it has no counterplay, or it can fully pivot to another strategy. Cyberstein OTK, for example, was only good due to how little interaction there was in early Yu-Gi-Oh! After a certain point, an opponent would be very unlikely to stop it. A more modern FDK, Pendulum Magician in 2018, played around its FDK much differently, Pendulum Magician could abuse Supreme King Starving Venom Dragon to loop Lyrilusk Independent Nightingale to burn an opponent. But what actually made this terrifying is that Pendulum Magician could include the necessary cards for this loop without taking away from the core Pendulum Magician strategy. So what would happen is Pendulum Magicians would set up for an FTK, and if they got hand trapped, they would pivot to basic Pendulum combos instead. Now, taking this back to decks on the tier list, like Nurse Burn or Treasure Panda combo, and a bit later Final Countdown, these don't have alternate win cons, and it being modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Certainly means your opponent will have a response. This pushes down these decks' ability to keep up with the current game, and it pushes down their spot on the tier list. Gaia are a very mediocre anime OTK deck. Basically, you special summon some Gaia main deck monsters to search for materials, then fusion summon Gaia with Spiral Fusion for an easy OTK. The deck has more consistency than it should, thanks to its 2 field spells, Gateway of Chaos and Galloping Gaia, both being able to search out big options. The main dragon is a searcher as well. What really holds this deck back is both a vulnerability to hand traps or a need to go second. You can fix a lot of this with outside engines like Branded or Kaijus, but it's still going to be noticeable. With the new support coming out in the OCG, hopefully this deck will get a boost. But with what we have now, it's looking kinda questionable. Here we have the first field spell or die deck on the tier list. If you can see the field spell, you have a relatively competent deck that could probably push up a tier on the list. But if you don't, you're left with an unplayable mess of problematic cards. In B.E.S.'s case, you either get swamped with a bunch of mediocre high-level boss monsters, or you see the field spell which not only lets you special summon these monsters, but also searches boss rush and turns those monsters into untargetable beat sticks. Basically, like you're playing Worse Cosmos. Between all the random machine support and the going second options, this deck will OTK very easily. Just make sure not to brick and whiff the field spell, cause then you're in trouble. There's a reason most field spell decks that are good are either given an additional search with the field spell, such as Generator Martyr for Generator Boss Stage, and Gilf the Phantom Bird for Golden Castle Stroinberg. By the way, B.E.S. stands for Big Ass Ships. Big Ass Ships. By the way, B.E.S. stands for Big Ass Ships. Chemicritters are another field spell dependent deck. However, unlike B.E.S., this deck has a built-in searcher with secondary effects that greatly improve the deck's consistency. The problems, however, start when you notice one particular word if you just zoom in on the text box. Yeah, this is a Gemini deck, meaning either double normal summons or an outside field spell like Catalyst Field, or Supervise. They've got a built-in field spell searcher, and luckily the actual monster effects aren't that bad once you get to them. They've got additional special summons, a nice searcher, and some great recursion from the graveyard. Chemicritter Meth Draco is actually a great boss monster for the Gemini mechanic, ripping cards out of the opponent's hand and getting board presence. It's just a shame that all of it is just pushed easily out of reach by the Gemini mechanic. Luckily the good ones are all level 2, meaning we can pair Chemicritters with Sprite very consistently. Plus there's always making Super Alloy Beast Rapnus for going into actually good Gemini combos. Worms are a dated flip deck with 2 very funny things going for them. First, they have W Nebula Meteorite, which is both a massive draw engine and can pull out our high-level worm monsters from the deck. Trust me, this would be quite good if it was still 2014. Second, the deck's fusion monster, Worm Zero, has no limits to how many materials it can use. That means with the power of future fusion, we can send as many worm monsters from deck to graveyard as possible. Does it achieve anything, really? No. Is it funny? Comedy gold. If you want a much more serious use of this deck, combine it with either Abyss for some actual field presence, or with as many floodgates as possible to play the deck as a stun deck. It's just about the only way to resolve Worm Yagin's flip effect these days. Despite the deck's popularity as a casual rogue option, Metaphys aren't all that great. People tend to confuse playing with Dimensional Shifter, Fisher, and Macrocosmos as being a good deck in general. But in this current format, when there's just so many better options, you can't justify this deck being considered good. Metaphys are a deck that get effects from the banish zone, the standby phase, after they're banished. Outside of that, their big monsters get removal, and the traps get us to those big monsters. The deck really is just too slow to be playable as we want it to be. It also has the unique problem of not really working all too well with outside engines, since this deck needs both a large amount of banish options, and it has to fit in a ton of bricks. So, unfortunately no. This isn't the answer as to why mutants exist. What we have is a weird stun deck that needs to see generic floodgate pieces to win. Do note that this build I'm showing uses Summoning Curse, which is great because the cost is actually an enabler in this deck, and I just think that's neat. Fortune Fairies, which are in fact different from Fortune Ladies, are a deck with the unfortunate gimmick of being tied to draws. When each Fortune Fairy is drawn, you can special summon them. Then you get an effect when they're special summoned. Unironically, this deck's power level is tied to the amount of draw power in the game. If Pot of Greed became legalized, this deck technically would benefit from it more than other decks around it on the tier list. The current builds of this deck focus on using cards like Wonder Wand, Spellbook of Knowledge, and Magician's Souls to turbo draw cards. Unfortunately, on top of the already sizable luck mechanic, we only want to see specific fortune fairies in a specific order, since some of them just aren't good. In general, you can always just whiff. It's an unfortunate deck all around. Maybe eventually, some outside spellcaster engine will flesh out the deck, but until then, this is gonna be rough. Slimes are weirdly good. They're certainly not out of casual, but they function as an engine that makes them more than just an okay Egyptian God engine. Most of that comes from two cards, Egyptian God Slime and Reactor Slime. Egyptian God Slime is a fantastic boss monster who gives targeting protection to all of your other monsters, as well as attack redirection. For some reason, he was over $50 before the most recent reprint. Actually absurd. The only downside to the card is that he needs a level 10, 0 attack Aqua monster to cheat out. That's where Reactor Slime comes in. Reactor Slime can make 2 tokens during main phase, at the cost of locking us into Divine Beast monsters. But what really matters is the second effect, of letting us tribute him to special summon Metal Reflect Slime from the deck. And Metal Reflect Slime meets our requirements to summon Egyptian God Slime. This creates a neat little slow casual engine that, if it was less vulnerable to hand traps, could see play as a valid tech in rogue decks. Hopefully it will once the price goes down. Before the newest wave of support, Volcanics are a weird burn, stall, and value deck. This deck is all about sending Volcanics to the grave to set up for extra effects. They have very solid card cycling and some random burn effects. But they are dependent on other decks or generic support for boss monsters or a larger goal. I guess you could say it's a shell of a deck. Since we can't have nice things right now, have a fun glimpse of what stupidity is possible in the future. This is going to get someone killed out of locals, especially with the new time rules. I'd say this new support brings up the deck to a high 4, maybe 5 placement on the tier list, but I do need to test it more before I can make that placement. Bamboo is a series of equip spells used for degenerate draw combos, FTKs, and literally nothing else. Golden Bamboo Sword lets us draw 2 cards if we control Broken Bamboo Sword. Cursed Bamboo Sword and Original Bamboo Sword both let us search out other bamboo cards. Obviously, there's synergy here with Exodia-type decks, especially with Royal Magical Library. But we can also potentially use this engine in general equip-type decks like Mechanico and even Noble Knights. It's not great, but it is a thing you can do. I think the funniest use of this deck is with Burning Bamboo Sword, which skips an opponent's main phase 1. If we combine this with Terminal World, we skip our opponent's entire turn. Well, unless they're playing Tearlaments, but I'm not going to think about that. My favorite part about this deck list is that the win con is unironically Scapegoat. Kaoi'ki Meiru is another dated stun deck. This deck has some very strong negates, solid searching, and for the longest time, made up the bulk of rock stun. Really what limits this deck is how hard special summons are for it, and how costly its negates are. You'll be turning either to an Adamancipator core, or Ties of the Brethren to turbo out special summons. These options, however, unfortunately lock you in to the rock portion of the deck. Most negates involve tributing themselves as cost, meaning sustainability is an issue. Kaoi'ki Meiru struggle from a common stun problem of not having an easy win con, despite honestly pretty good stun options. Counter Fairies are the alternative lineup of Parshath Fairies. These cards focus on getting value from counter traps, like Solemn Judgment, Solemn Warning, and Solemn Strike. Basically being a deck that doesn't have to pay heavy cost for these traps, and then being able to reload a board. The deck also gets to play options to protect the back row like Lord of Heavenly Prison and Sanctum of Parshath. Now, theoretically this deck is very powerful, but there are some massive issues. You need to see Bountiful Artemis and Guiding Ariadne to play into the late game. Plus, if you don't see one of your protector cards, those traps are going to start disappearing really quickly, especially with the number of extenders in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Those 3 to 4 negates could theoretically be powered through. And most importantly, Counter Fairies are a trap deck, so you really have to go first. Vylons are a synchro equip archetype that takes advantage of poorly designed cards to sometimes perform an infinite loop and win games. The loop works by using Vylon Element to summon a tuner every time a Vylon card is destroyed. Combining this with Rod of Silence and recursive equips, we get an infinite amount of monsters, only restricted if we use them for synchro monsters. Of course, this loop is extremely gimmicky, requires a large amount of bricks, and is very vulnerable to disruption. Most of the effort with playing this comes from finding outside engines to make the loop startable, and this isn't easy. At least the new Power Tool Braver Dragon helps the deck out a bit as a generic boss monster for an equipped deck. Twilightsworns are the unfortunate, unfinished, and unloved offshoot of Lightsworns. opting instead to get value from banishing cards as opposed to milling them. The Twilightsworn Lumina revives from the Banish Zone instead of the regular versions revived from Graveyard. Twilightsworns as inversions take their cues from the first wave of Lightsworn support, meaning their monsters lack inherent ways to spam Banish or mills off top deck, nor do they have the effects a player would want. Without some outside engine doing most of the work like Chaos, actual Lightsworns or Ishizus, this deck can't function. But Twilightsworns also drag down any archetype they're attached to. The engine used to have some viability back when Fairy Tail Snow was in the game at 3, but now it just lacks options. Maybe if Konami actually finished releasing Twilight versions of each Lightsworn monster, we could actually have some power behind the engine. Unfortunately, it's been about 5 years, and Twilightsworn Wolf might actually be a good card, so I don't think Konami will ever print the rest of these. Toons are one of the most consistent decks on the list, thanks to its many incredibly powerful searchers. Toon Table of Contents, Toon Bookmark, and Toon Page Flip. Toon Kingdom also provides some astounding protection for monsters. The deck can also steal support for Red Eyes Black Dragon, Dark Magician, and Cyber Dragon, thanks to having those supports' names. Typically, this is going to be used to put Blackstone of Legend, to summon Toon Red Eyes Black Dragon, or make Chimera Tech Megafleet Dragon going second. The issues with Toons arise once you stop and look at the mediocre effects provided by the Toon monsters themselves. We have some targeted card destruction, a single special summon from the deck, and a Blackluster Soldier effect. The better effects being restricted to higher level monsters, of course. The deck also has to make sure it controls the field spell, or auto-lose. Take all this together, and you have a janky deck that ends up being unable to play into situations other decks would be perfectly fine with. Perhaps the worst victim of the Pendulum rule changes is Igknights, a deck whose gimmick is being normal monsters, and getting to search other archetypal cards by blowing up their own pendulum scales. Since loading up the extra deck is no longer good, we have to double down on the normal monster aspect of the deck. The most powerful option available to this deck is Heatwave, which states at the start of your main phase, neither player can special summon effect monsters until your next draw phase. This does lock you in the normal summons, but that's quite fine for the trade-off. If we want to take a different approach to Igknights, we can also opt to play around an Infernoble Knight engine, an option that gets significantly better once the new Infernoble Knight support drops in a couple of sets. I do think this list is lacking a bit of polish, but the idea is there, so consider building off of it. Valkyrie are a battle phase fairy deck that has some solid effects with absurd drawbacks. For example, Ride of the Valkyries lets us swarm the board with Valkyrie monsters at the cost of shuffling our monsters back into the deck at the end of the turn. The deck also has a really fun double battle phase gimmick, and tons of solid in-archetype searching. The problem, of course, comes from the lack of inherent disruptions, which need to come from outside archetypes. To facilitate this, we can use generic fairy support, like Valhalla Hall of the Fallen, or even the Agent of Creation Venus, and the Mystic Shineball engine to easily swarm the board. A much larger source of disruption comes from the always powerful Archlord Christia, who lets us lock out special summoning. However, we are still left at a massive disadvantage when compared to other decks, as the Valkyrie engine is very weak. Plus, the engine is large enough to make running a significant amount of generic cards kind of difficult. Blackluster Soldier is another Yu-Gi-Oh! Legacy anime deck. This one shares some of the support for the before-mentioned Gaia archetype. However, Blackluster Soldier has two additional gimmicks that keep it afloat. First, the deck is Chaos-based, meaning it can abuse cards like Chaos Space and the Wyvern Busters, inherently in the strategy. The problems with the deck come from its second gimmick. It's also a ritual deck. Now, it does actually have some spice for its ritual summons. It can send a card from deck to graveyard for the summon, and it has some honestly solid inheritable effects from the beginning and evening Twilight Nights. Plus, Blackluster Soldier Legendary Swordsman has the chat effect of being able to shuffle all cards an opponent controls into the deck once it does battle damage. And all of this doesn't overcome how costly ritual summons are, nor how hard it can be to play around modern decks with these cards. Phantasm Spiral, or a normal monster stun deck, also having synergy with Yuumi since their field spell counts as it, and the traps get to activate from hand if you control Yuumi. This deck contains several trap cards with mediocre disruption effects, if you control a normal monster. So mostly this deck gets played as a stun floodgate deck to compensate for all the problems of what I just said. Also, the deck tends to play Megalo Smasher X instead of Phantasm Spiral Dragon as its normal monster of choice. It's a cool tech to ignore the level requirement while also finding better typing of its main monster. The deck as a whole will more than likely struggle to keep up in games, especially after the side deck. If you ignore Red Reboot, this list is very solid. Mecha Phantom Beast are a token-generating Synchro and XYZ combo deck. The problem is, they're just too slow at spamming out monsters to actually benefit from their options. Plus, Mecha Phantom Beast Auroradon and Haoki Fibrax are banned, taking away most of the generic crutches this deck liked to use. So, what do we still have? First, the deck can use Speedroids as a tuner engine to push into synchros easier. We can also use the Super Heavy Samurai engine to set up for a Yugioh Gigant X for a search. And lastly, we can use the Mecha Phantom Beast token generation to set up for some effects. It's not perfect and certainly not straightforward, but making a Baron de Fleur plus a Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon on a good hand can actually support a deck. Just don't expect to do that too often. Felgrand is a weird small level 8 dragon deck very similar to Blue Eyes. In fact, if the main monster said Blue Eyes instead of Felgrand, it wouldn't feel remotely out of place. What this deck does is equip dragon monsters to its 2 main warrior monsters from deck, while its main dragon is a DD Crow when it's special summoned. The engine as a whole is just dated. While it can pull out a dragon monster from the deck, it's much too slow and convoluted to do it well. You'll probably just be spamming Nebula Dragon or Dragon Link combos most of the time anyway when playing the deck. At least Felgrand is very solid with OTKs. It's not like any dragon deck actually needed help with that, but let's take the wins where we can get them. Frogs have not been treated kindly by Konami. Unfortunately, seeing Ronin Toon, their main special summoned, banned because it was used as a major combo enabler in Sprite. Luckily, we still have Totally Awesome, and now we even have back Substitute to 1. Modern Frog builds just flat out replace Ronin Toon for Poison Draw Frog. Unfortunately, Poison Draw Frog misses timing when Link summoning, making it more or less just a level 2 body for Totally Awesome. But we can use it with Substitute for actual good plays. It's just a shame it's not more consistent and faster. Frogs still make their way into a variety of decks. Paleozoics, the series of trap monsters, are a classic pairing since they both work for Water XYZ plays. Sprites still technically play Swap Frogs, although it doesn't quite count for this tier list. Lastly, we can play Frogs with Runic for a more stun-oriented build. Multiple Piece Golem is a janky fusion deck where you have to get both Big Piece Golem and Medium Piece Golem onto the field for a fusion summon. But Medium Piece Golem can summon out Small Piece Golem from deck if you control a Big Piece Golem and vice versa. The biggest thing to note about this deck is that they're Rock type, meaning we can combine them with Adamancipators for actual access to the engine. Not only that, Big Piece Golem is easily accessible by Doki Doki, letting us get around some of the restrictions with the deck, especially while running Gigastone Omega, who's a good extra level 5 Earth special summon. Theoretically, the deck could also make use of fusion deployment in the Fossil engine to help consistency. All this turns what should be a bad archetype into a weak but functional engine. It's still not consistent, nor is the fusion any good, but it can sometimes result in putting additional monsters onto the field, and it's not the worst, especially with Adamancipators doing all the heavy lifting. Chainburn is a format-dependent stun burn deck. Chainburn suffers from the same problem every stun deck this format does. It's vulnerable to back row removal, can vary widely from matchup to matchup, and it has a Mystic Mind-shaped hole in the deck list. Chainburn specifically uses the gimmick of trying to set up a big chain link for the card Chainburn to get maximum damage. It abuses traps that burn depending on the size of the opponent's board, and generally just tries to slow the game down. The deck's core has largely stayed the same since its conception more than 10 years ago, but adding in newer traps like Gravedigger's Trap Hole, and engines like Lilith Lady of Lament, the TCG ban list just isn't kind enough to this toxic mess of a deck to allow it to be any higher on the tier list. Right next to Chainburn is its even slower, but more versatile cousin, Final Countdown, trading out burn cards for pure stall. Final Countdown blends in with most Exodia strategies as a backup win con, stacking Battle Faders and other lacking stun options. Current builds tend to make use of Crooked Cook Shark Stall. Crooked Cook is unaffected by other card effects if he's the only card you control. Right Hand Shark provides battle protection to an X or Z monster that uses it as material. Put these two together, you have a Kaiju piercing a lose situation for a lot of decks. It's not great, but it ends up being playable enough to steal some games, even at a higher level. Just don't expect to be able to do the same once the side deck hits Game 2 and 3. Vehicle Roids are the worst of the Roid archetypes. That, however, doesn't mean they're without spice. Vehicle Roids have a very funny boss monster, Super Vehicle Roid Mobile Base, who can special summon Roids right out from the deck. This is great and has an absurd 5,000 defense, but he's incredibly clunky for the deck to make on its own, so we have to rely on outside combos for help. First, we can use Instant and Ready Fusion to cheese through the extra deck requirements. A more impressive combo is using Fusion Deployment to summon Sangan from the deck and then pop it with Megaroid City, netting the player some absurd value. Lastly, Mixeroid can Fusion Summon from the graveyard for some great plays. The problem is that even with all this, you're still going to be too slow to keep up with modern Yu-Gi-Oh! So you'll have to run more outside help like Floodgates, Eldritch, heroes are something spicy. The creativity seen in this deck's fans is off the charts, but it's not enough to push the deck up any higher. Do note, also included in the description is a 25-page tutorial for how to play Vehicleroids that gets updated somewhat constantly. It's worth a read. It's also worth noting that most Discord groups for decks have dedicated fans and have guides just like this. The Charmer group has at least 5 20-page guides. The Yugioh fanbase is amazing, and I'm happy to be able to use all of the resources provided to me by the community. There's a link to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Discord suppository, and I recommend you check that out. It's just below the link to my Discord and social medias, which you should also follow. Malefics are a super simple beatdown deck. Play a field spell and summon big boys. You really do have some decent options, since monsters like Malefic Stardust and Malefic Cyber and Dragon are such free summons. Really, the only problem with this deck is it needs its continuous spell Malefic Territory to really pop off, since it removes the one Malefic monster restriction. Luckily, this deck does have some search options available to it, even if they are kind of janky. Malefic Paradox Gear is also a fantastic starter that actually lets the deck use Malefic Paradox Dragon's powerful revival effect. Just ignore that Ash Blossom exists. I will remind everyone that this deck will literally blow itself up if the field spell gets destroyed. It's like a much worse version of the Eternal Soul problem in Dark Magicians, meaning it can be impossible to go second once that side deck hits. Shino Birds are a ritual spirit deck, and they have the weaknesses of both mechanics. Spirits are forced to return to your hand the turn after they're normal summoned, making them really jank to use. Luckily, spirits have tons of spicy support options. Shino Baroness Peacock lets us special summon a spirit monster from deck, ignoring their summoning conditions, meaning we can pull out Yatagarasu or one of the Tamas from the deck. We also have the spice available to us from Hino Kagusuchi, who can get rid of our opponent's hand if he goes to battle phase. Unfortunately, Shino Birds do just have the problem of massively bricking. Even with being able to run pre-preparation of rites, this deck will still have to run an outside engine, such as Incantations or Ritual Dogmatica. These unfortunately limit what options are available to the player due to the large amount of deck space they occupy. Here is one of the decks of all time made by me. The goal is to play Exo Sisters turn 1, and then surprise the opponent with a Shino Bird board wipe, and then Yada Lock on turn 2. This is a mess and a terrible idea, but it works more than it should. Box of Friends is the normal monster summon spam deck, who more often than not need to be paired with another bad normal engine to fire. What Box of Friends do on their own is use Doll Happiness to set up for a free rank 4 play, or to use Grandpa Dementia for a free rank 8 play. With all the normal support in the game like Unexpected Die and White Elf and Skift, this deck is not that inconsistent. The real downside to the deck is how overly vulnerable to hand traps this is. If an opponent actually figures out how your deck works, they will stop Doll Happiness or Box of Friends from resolving. You also will be running a ton of normal monsters to get the strategy to work. Artifacts are a monster back row counter deck, special summoning themselves out from back row once they are destroyed by card effect. This once meta-dominating deck has been decimated by time, and the only thing they really still had going for them, Artifact Scythe, is currently banned. Artifacts have limited disruptions as well, mostly being locked into morale attacks, single target destruction, and the rank 5 artifact Durandal. What artifacts really lack is a faster version of their engine, since they can only activate on the opponent's turn. It means breaking boards is going to be impossible. The deck did not age well, especially with current decks being able to play on the opponent's turn. Perhaps we can run artifacts with a rank 5 deck. Cyber Dragons, Chronomies, and Constellars come to mind, but don't hold your breath. War Rocks are a bad battle phase deck. They have a ton of surprisingly solid options that would have absolutely dominated the game 10 years ago. As of right now, the deck has design issues of trading traditional disruptions for more battle phase gas. That's not to say it has no gas, as War Rock Dignity and War Rock Medium are good cards, but as a whole it lacks pressure. What they mostly have is battle phase searching, battle phase negates, and attack gaining. Even their floating mechanic is limited, since they specify being sent to graveyard by card effect. War Rock's typing also presents a really lackluster opportunity, Earth Warrior, neither of which have a lot of support outside of very specific archetypes, meaning there's not a lot of room for hybrid builds. All in all, it's just kinda mediocre. Here's a deck that's never talked about, despite having absolute powerhouses throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history. From Krebons to Emergency Teleport to Psychic Wielder, and the new Psychic in Punisher, it's Psychic Synchro. The deck never doing anything, only due to its lack of a good boss monster, which we now have with Psychic in Punisher, a Towers monster with good removal. This deck has plenty of monster spam, but without much ability to generate card advantage. It ultimately limits how powerful this deck can be. Plus, most of the Psychic engine just isn't good. It's really only a few modern support cards holding up the deck. And more importantly, the monster levels this deck likes to spam out aren't the best for making Psychic and Punisher. On the plus side, this deck works brilliant with both Assault Mode, generic Synchron tools, and Punk, which kinda just feels like a modernized version of this deck. Psychic Synchro are very close to making it the casual, but just lack that extra push to confidently put it that high. Melodious are a Fairy Fusion monster spam deck. Typically they focus on a few niche combos for beginner level locks and simple OTKs. For example, by making Arya the Melodious Diva and LG the Melodious Diva, all Melodious monsters can't be destroyed by battle or card effects, as well as having targeting protection. This honestly is really easy for most decks to out, but the Melodious Link monster makes it so easy to go into this. The entire deck works around this Link monster's power, and then relying more on the fusion summons for OTKs. So, Melodious seem like they have decent plays of decent quality. What's the problem then? Well, the good cards lock us into Melodious monsters, and the main engine can take up a lot of space, meaning we have limited room for staple cards and other engines, kind of holding down an already mediocre deck. Yugioh are a very dated machine spam deck, mostly being held up by generic machine support and 2 nuts cards. Those 2 cards in Gear are Gear Accelerator and Gear Gigant X. Accelerator special summons himself for free if you control another Gear monster. Gigant X searches any level 4 or lower machine monster from deck or graveyard. Together they make for a very solid combo core. Combine this with gold and silver gadgets, Infinitrax and other Earth machines, we have a deck that we can pretend isn't dated to 2014. And a few cards like Yugioh Geiger have gotten better over time. The issues come with getting enough gas to get the combo rolling. The last time this deck was meta, it used a flip monster and a trap card to swarm the board. It's just not fast enough in the modern landscape. And that's the end for part 1. Jesus Christ, this one went long. We've covered an astounding 115 decks, and I think this video has gone on for more than twice the length of the original part 1 a year ago. Never fucking say I don't put effort into these videos. Ugh. Make sure to subscribe for the next part that comes out in 1 to 2 months. Got some smaller videos I want to do first, but I'll see you next time.